Dog came to railway station every day for 10 years. The reason will melt your heart. The first snowflakes of December drifted through the air as James Carter checked his watch for the third time. The 4:15 train to Millbrook would arrive at Grandview Station any minute, and his palms were slick with sweat despite the winter chill. This wasn't the ordinary anxiety of a traveling salesman worried about missing an appointment. The stakes today were life and death. "Easy, buddy," he murmured to the golden retriever pressed against his leg. The 6-year-old dog's amber eyes looked up with concern, sensing his master's tension. James forced a smile and scratched behind Buddy's ears, earning a tail wag that thumped against his suitcase. "Just one more trip. Then we're free." James scanned the holiday crowd filling the platform. Good cover, but impossible to spot potential watchers. His hand instinctively patted his coat pocket, feeling the outline of the flash drive that had shattered his life 3 days ago. One wrong click while preparing a sales report, and he'd uncovered evidence that Westlake Industries, his employer of 12 years, was laundering money for organizations on international watch lists. An anonymous tip to the FBI later, and James found himself marked for elimination. The warning had come from Janet in accounting. "They know someone accessed those files. They're checking logs. Get out while you can." He'd barely had time to pack before spotting the black sedan outside his house. Only his habit of walking Buddy through back trails had allowed them to escape unnoticed. Now, after 2 nights in cheap motels, they were making their final run. His sister Elizabeth would hide them in Millbrook until the authorities moved on his information. The station's speaker crackled. "Train 407 to Millbrook now approaching platform 3. Please stand behind the yellow line." James tightened his grip on Buddy's leash. The dog had been his only constant companion since his wife Sarah's death 4 years earlier. While friends and colleagues gradually drifted away from the grieving widower, Buddy remained steadfast, sleeping at the foot of James's empty bed and offering silent comfort on the anniversaries that still cut like glass. "Stay close," James whispered, meeting those trusting eyes. "No wandering." Buddy pressed his muzzle against James's palm, a gesture that always felt like a promise. Sarah had trained him well before her illness. The retriever understood dozens of commands and could read subtle shifts in human emotion with uncanny accuracy. The train screeched to a halt, doors hissing open. James scanned the platform one last time before joining the surge of passengers. There were 3 people from the door when James spotted him, a tall man in a dark overcoat, standing too still amidst the bustling crowd. Their eyes met briefly before the man's hand moved toward his inside pocket. James reacted instinctively, shoving his way onto the train. In his panic, Buddy's leash slipped from his sweaty palm. "Ticket, sir?" the conductor asked, blocking James's path. "Yes." James fumbled in his pocket, glancing back for Buddy. Through gaps in the crowd, he caught glimpses of golden fur as the dog tried to push through the wall of bodies that had formed between them. "Buddy!" James called, panic rising. "Come!" The dog barked in response, barely audible over the station noise. James thrust his ticket at the conductor and turned to reach back, but the crowd had become impenetrable. Worse, the dark-coated man was now moving purposefully toward the train. "Sir, please move into the carriage," the conductor insisted. "We're departing." "My dog," James protested, straining to see. The platform warning bell sounded. Doors began to close along the train. "Wait!" James lunged toward the narrowing gap, catching a final glimpse of Buddy's confused expression before the doors sealed shut with pneumatic finality. Through the glass, he saw Buddy leap up, paws scrabbling at the door, bark muted by the barrier. Behind the dog, the man in the dark coat had paused, his attention now fixed on Buddy. "Stop the train! I need to go back!" James shouted, pounding on the door as the train lurched forward. The conductor firmly guided him away. "Sir, you can't exit until the next station." James watched helplessly as Buddy raced alongside the departing train until the platform's end forced him to stop. The last image was his loyal companion standing forlorn at the edge, growing smaller with each second, while the dark-coated man approached from behind. "Buddy," James whispered brokenly. He reached for his phone to call Elizabeth, hoping she might somehow rescue his dog, but froze when he saw a notification. Unknown number. One voicemail message. With trembling fingers, he pressed play. Through static came Janet's voice, breathless and terrified. "They know it was you, James. Malone has men at the station. They're not just going to scare you off. Don't board that train. Run." Too late. The message had arrived while his phone was silenced during the anxious wait. Now the train was accelerating, carrying him toward Millbrook, where Elizabeth would be waiting, easy to identify, easy to follow, easy to use as leverage. The train rounded a bend, and Grandview Station disappeared from view. James leaned his forehead against the cold window, fighting back tears. He'd left behind the one soul who had stood by him without question. "I'll come back for you," he promised silently. "Whatever it takes." 20 minutes later, James made his decision as the train approached Riverside Junction, a small transfer point. When it slowed for its momentary stop, he activated the emergency door release and jumped onto the dimly lit platform, wincing as his ankle twisted on impact. Behind him, confused shouts rose as station staff noticed the unauthorized exit. James limped quickly toward the shadows, planning to find a phone, warn Elizabeth away from Millbrook Station, then somehow return to Grandview for Buddy. He reached the edge of the junction's small parking lot, and froze. A black sedan was parked near the exit, engine idling. As James watched, the passenger door opened, and a familiar silhouette emerged, the man from Grandview's platform. They had anticipated his move. They'd been tracking his phone. James turned and ran toward the dark woods separating the junction from the highway, abandoning his suitcase, knowing it was already too late. Back at Grandview Station, Buddy paced anxiously at the spot where he'd last seen James. Station security tried approaching, but the normally friendly retriever growled, backing away. As the evening crowd thinned, Martha Jenkins, who ran the station's coffee kiosk, noticed the dog still waiting. She'd seen him arrive with his owner earlier. "Poor thing," she murmured, filling a paper bowl with water. "Your person will come back for you." She placed it near Buddy, maintaining distance. The dog eventually drank but returned immediately to his vigil, amber eyes fixed on the tracks where the train had disappeared. As Martha prepared to close her kiosk, she noticed something disturbing: the man in the dark overcoat, watching the dog with unusual intensity from the shadows. Something about his focused attention sent a chill through her. Martha hesitated, then approached Buddy again with half a turkey sandwich. "Come on, boy," she called softly. "Come with me tonight. We'll sort everything out tomorrow." To her surprise, the dog looked at her, then back at the tracks, then once more at her, as if weighing impossible choices. Something shifted in that canine mind. Buddy gave one last look down the empty tracks before padding slowly toward Martha, accepting both food and temporary guidance. As they walked toward the employee exit, Martha glanced back. The man in the dark coat was gone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just transpired, something beyond a simple act of kindness. Neither Martha nor Buddy could have imagined that this night marked the beginning of a vigil that would span a decade, or that the secret behind James Carter's disappearance would remain buried almost as long as the man himself. The first rays of morning sunlight streamed through Martha's kitchen window as she watched Buddy pace restlessly near her front door. The golden retriever had barely slept, spending most of the night staring out the window in the direction of Grandview Station. When Martha had tried to coax him onto the dog bed she'd improvised from old blankets, he'd only settled momentarily before resuming his anxious vigilance. "Your owner really means a lot to you, doesn't he?" Martha murmured, setting down a bowl of water and some leftover chicken she'd shredded for him. Buddy sniffed at the offering but didn't eat, his amber eyes fixed on the door. Martha sighed, checking her watch. Her shift at the station coffee kiosk started in an hour. She'd planned to call animal control, but something about the mysterious man watching Buddy the previous night made her uneasy. What if the dog's separation from his owner hadn't been accidental? "All right, boy," she decided. "You can come with me today. Maybe your person will come back looking for you." Buddy's ears perked up at that, as if he understood perfectly. They arrived at Grandview Station just as Harold Wilson, the station manager, was unlocking the main entrance. His bushy eyebrows rose at the sight of Martha with the golden retriever trotting beside her. "Found yourself a friend?" he asked, his gruff voice softened by curiosity. "He got separated from his owner yesterday," Martha explained. "The man boarded the 4:15 to Millbrook, but the dog couldn't get on in time. Poor thing's been waiting ever since." Harold frowned. "Station policy says no strays, Martha." "He's not a stray," she insisted. "He's temporarily separated. There's a difference. His collar has tags. His name is Buddy." Before Harold could respond, Buddy suddenly stiffened, his attention captured by the approaching rumble of the 6:05 arrival from Millbrook. Without warning, he bolted toward Platform 3, the same platform where James had departed the previous evening. "Buddy, wait!" Martha called, hurrying after him. The retriever stopped at the exact spot where he had last seen James, his posture alert, tail raised hopefully as passengers began disembarking. He scrutinized each face with intense concentration, his entire body vibrating with anticipation. But as the crowd thinned and the last passenger stepped off, Buddy's tail gradually lowered. He remained standing, eyes fixed on the empty train doorway, as if by sheer will he could manifest his missing master. "That's the spot where they got separated," Martha explained as Harold caught up. "He thinks his owner is coming back on another train." Something in Buddy's steadfast devotion softened Harold's bureaucratic resolve. "He can stay until noon," he conceded. "Then we'll have to call animal control." But noon came and went, and so did the afternoon trains and evening commuters. Buddy accepted water and small bites of food from Martha but refused to leave his post for more than a few minutes at a time. When closing time approached, Martha tried to coax him to leave with her again, but this time, Buddy was immovable. "He's determined to stay," Martha told Harold, concern evident in her voice. "I don't think he'll come with me." Harold studied the dog's resolute posture, then sighed heavily. "Leave him a blanket. The security guard can keep an eye on him overnight. But tomorrow—" "I know," Martha nodded. "Tomorrow we call animal control." Yet when tomorrow came, neither Martha nor Harold made that call. Something about Buddy's patient vigilance struck a chord with the station staff and regular commuters, who began bringing him treats and offering gentle words of encouragement. Thomas Finch, the elderly ticket collector, was particularly taken with the loyal dog. "Reminds me of that Japanese dog, Hachiko, I think his name was. Waited for his deceased owner at a station for years." "Don't say that," Martha scolded. "Buddy's owner could still come back." Days turned into weeks. Buddy established a routine that the station staff quickly learned to respect. Each morning, he would inspect every arriving train from Millbrook, approaching the doors expectantly as passengers disembarked. After each disappointment, he would return to his spot, amber eyes fixed on the tracks, waiting for the next opportunity. Harold, who had initially been concerned about regulations, found himself becoming Buddy's unlikely advocate. He installed a proper dog bed near Platform 3, along with water and food bowls that the staff kept filled. When a junior employee suggested removing the stray, Harold's response was uncharacteristically sharp. "That dog's not bothering anyone," he snapped. "If anything, he's teaching all of us something about loyalty." As winter melted into spring, Buddy's story began to spread beyond the confines of Grandview Station. Local children would stop by after school to pat his head and whisper encouragements. Regular commuters would pause in their daily rush to offer a treat or a kind word. Even tourists passing through would ask about the waiting dog, as he had come to be known. Through it all, Buddy maintained his steadfast vigil. His once gleaming coat lost some of its luster, and a hint of gray began to appear around his muzzle, but his determination never wavered. Every train from Millbrook received his full inspection, every passenger his hopeful scrutiny. "It's been 3 months," Martha remarked to Harold one bright April morning as they watched Buddy rising stiffly from his bed at the sound of an approaching train. "Do you think his owner is ever coming back?" Harold's weathered face was thoughtful. I've been wondering about that. I checked the lost and found records. No one's reported a missing golden retriever matching his description. That seems strange, doesn't it? Martha frowned. If someone accidentally left their dog behind, wouldn't they call the station immediately? Unless they couldn't, Harold said quietly. Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas hurrying toward them, waving a newspaper. You won't believe this, he exclaimed, spreading the paper on a nearby bench. Look at the headline. The front page featured a small article titled, Missing Salesman Investigation Continues. Beneath it was a grainy photograph of a man that made Martha gasp. That's him, she whispered. That's Buddy's owner. According to the article, James Carter, a sales representative for Westlake Industries, had failed to arrive for a scheduled meeting in Millbrook 3 months earlier. His sister Elizabeth had reported him missing when he never arrived at her home. The police investigation had yielded few leads, and the company had offered a modest reward for information. It says he was last seen boarding a train at Grandview Station, Thomas read aloud, his voice dropping. But there's no mention of a dog. The three exchanged troubled glances, then all turned to look at Buddy, who had returned to his bed after yet another disappointment. The loyal dog lay with his head on his paws, amber eyes fixed on the tracks with unwavering hope. He's not waiting for someone who abandoned him, Harold realized. He's waiting for someone who disappeared. The mystery of James Carter's fate would remain unsolved for years to come. But Buddy's vigil had only just begun, a daily ritual of hope and heartbreak that would eventually capture hearts across the nation and, in time, uncover truths that powerful men had tried to bury alongside James himself. 5 years had passed since that December evening when Buddy was separated from James Carter. What had begun as a temporary situation had evolved into a legend. Grandview's faithful friend, as the local newspaper had dubbed him, had become more than just a waiting dog. He was a living monument to loyalty that drew visitors from across the country. A bronze plaque now adorned Platform 3. For Buddy, who teaches us the meaning of devotion. Children would touch it for luck before exams, and couples would meet there, believing that a relationship blessed by Buddy's faithful spirit would endure any hardship. The golden retriever himself had aged visibly. His muzzle was now completely white, and arthritis had slowed his movements. Yet his routine remained unchanged. Every morning, he would rise from his bed, now a proper doghouse built by local craftsmen, and inspect the first train from Millbrook. Though his expectations had perhaps dimmed, his vigilance never faltered. But while the public saw only a heartwarming tale of canine loyalty, Harold Wilson had begun assembling a different narrative, one far more troubling than abandoned pets or forgotten promises. "I don't like this, Martha," Harold murmured as they sat in his office after hours, a folder of newspaper clippings spread before them. "It's been 5 years, and the police investigation into Carter's disappearance is still officially open but practically abandoned." Martha nodded, her once auburn hair now streaked with gray. In the years since Buddy's arrival, she and Harold had formed an unlikely investigative partnership, collecting every scrap of information they could find about James Carter. "And now this," Harold continued, tapping a recent article about Westlake Industries. "Third executive in 2 years to die under accidental circumstances. You think they're connected to James's disappearance?" Martha asked, though she already suspected the answer. Harold leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "I spoke with Elizabeth Carter again yesterday. She's convinced her brother stumbled onto something at Westlake that got him finished. Said he'd called her sounding anxious the week before he disappeared, telling her to be careful about what she said on the phone. Their amateur investigation had begun 3 years earlier, after a strange encounter with a man who claimed to have known James. The visitor had appeared one rainy Tuesday, watching Buddy for hours before approaching Harold. "That dog isn't waiting for someone who's coming back," the man had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's waiting for someone to find the truth." Before Harold could question him further, the man had pressed a business card into his hand and walked away. The card bore only a name, Daniel Reeves, and a phone number that, when called, connected to a voicemail that was never answered. That cryptic encounter had sparked something in Harold, transforming casual curiosity into determined investigation. He'd reached out to Elizabeth Carter, connected with former colleagues of James, and begun assembling a timeline of events surrounding the salesman's disappearance. The picture that emerged was disturbing. James Carter hadn't been a simple traveling salesman but rather an IT specialist with access to Westlake's financial databases. Several colleagues recalled his increasing anxiety in the weeks before his disappearance. One mentioned James asking subtle questions about certain overseas accounts that seemed to have irregularities. Most telling was the statement from Janet Reeves, presumably Daniel's relative, who had worked in accounting at Westlake. She'd abruptly quit her job 3 days after James vanished and moved across the country. When Harold finally tracked her down by phone, she'd spoken only 4 words before hanging up. "They're still watching me." A knock at the office door interrupted Harold's thoughts. Thomas entered, his once limber frame now stooped with age, but his eyes still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You need to see this," he said, placing a newspaper on the desk. It was the financial section of a national paper, featuring an article about corporate fraud investigations. Westlake Industries was prominently mentioned, though no charges had yet been filed. "Look at the byline," Thomas urged. The article was written by Michael Donovan, a name that meant nothing to Harold until he saw the note Thomas had scribbled in the margin. "Friend of James Carter, according to Elizabeth." "Coincidence?" Martha asked. Harold shook his head slowly. "I don't believe in those anymore. Not where James Carter is concerned." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft beep from Harold's computer, an alert from the station's security system. The 3 gathered around the monitor to see a tall man in an expensive suit standing on platform 3, watching Buddy. "That's Malcolm Malone," Thomas whispered. "CEO of Westlake Industries." Harold zoomed in on the security feed. The CEO wasn't alone. 2 men with the unmistakable bearing of security personnel stood at a discreet distance. Malone was kneeling before Buddy, his hand extended with what appeared to be a treat. "What's he doing here?" Martha's voice was tight with alarm. They watched as Buddy, normally friendly with strangers, backed away from Malone's outstretched hand, head lowered and body language defensive. "Dogs remember," Thomas said softly. "They remember scents, voices, threats." Harold reached for his coat. "I'm going down there." By the time he reached platform A3, Malone and his entourage had departed. Buddy sat alert in his bed, eyes fixed on the station entrance with unusual intensity. When Harold approached, the dog pressed against his leg in an uncharacteristic display of anxiety. "What did he want with you, boy?" Harold murmured, stroking Buddy's head. "What does he know?" The answer would come from an unexpected source. The following morning, a young reporter named Alyssa Chen arrived at the station, requesting an interview about Buddy for a feature article. Harold, initially reluctant, agreed after discovering she worked with Michael Donovan at the National Observer. "Mr. Donovan suggested I speak with you," Alyssa explained once they were seated in Harold's office. "He thought you might have insights about James Carter's connection to Westlake Industries." Harold studied her carefully. "What's your real interest here, Miss Chen?" "Because there are dozens of reporters who could write a heartwarming piece about a loyal dog." Alyssa's professional demeanor faltered slightly. "Mr. Donovan believes Westlake is involved in extensive money laundering for several criminal organizations. He thinks James Carter discovered evidence of this before he disappeared." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "And we think that dog knows something, or rather saw something, that could break this case wide open." "That's absurd," Harold scoffed, though his pulse quickened. "Buddy's just a dog waiting for his owner." Alyssa placed a photograph on the desk. It showed James Carter standing beside Malcolm Malone at a company function. This man disappeared without a trace 5 years ago. The official investigation has found nothing. Yet his dog maintains a daily vigil at the exact spot where he was last seen. Don't you find that strange? Loyal dogs are nothing new, Harold countered. True, Alyssa agreed. But dogs that refuse to approach the CEO of their owner's former company? Dogs that were present the night their owner vanished? That's a different story, She paused, evaluating Harold's reaction. Mr. Wilson, we believe James Carter was finished because of what he discovered. And we think that whoever did it might have left evidence right here at Grandview Station. Harold's thoughts raced. Could Buddy's unwavering vigil be about more than simple loyalty? Was he waiting not for James to return, but for justice to finally arrive? What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Chin? That maybe it's time to look more closely at where that dog sits every day, she replied, her expression grave. Because loyal animals don't just wait, sometimes they stand guard. As if summoned by her words, a commotion erupted outside the office. They rushed out to find Buddy barking frantically at Platform 3, where workers had begun preliminary renovations on the aging station's infrastructure. The retriever was pawing desperately at a section of flooring that had been marked for replacement, his usually calm demeanor transformed by sudden urgency. Something was hidden beneath Grandview Station, and after 5 years of patient waiting, Buddy was finally ready to reveal his secret. The discovery beneath Platform 3 stunned everyone. When workers removed the section of flooring that Buddy had been pawing at so frantically, they found a sealed plastic bag wedged between the support beams. Inside was a water-damaged envelope addressed simply to Elizabeth, in hurried handwriting. Police were called immediately. The area was cordoned off, and the envelope was taken into evidence. Harold, Martha, and Thomas watched anxiously as Detective Rivera, who had been assigned to James Carter's cold case years earlier, carefully placed the envelope in an evidence bag. "How is this possible?" Martha whispered, her hand resting protectively on Buddy's head. The retriever, now calm after his frantic barking, sat with unusual stillness, his eyes fixed on the envelope, as if his mission was finally accomplished. "Dogs have extraordinary senses," Detective Rivera said, his skepticism from previous conversations with Harold notably absent. He might have detected his owner's scent all these years, even through the flooring. But Harold suspected something more profound. "Or maybe he saw what happened that night," he suggested quietly. "Maybe he's been trying to tell us all along." Local media descended on Grandview Station within hours. The story of a loyal dog potentially solving a 5-year-old disappearance was irresistible. News crews filmed Buddy in his now famous spot, speculating about what the mysterious envelope might contain. Elizabeth Carter arrived the following day, her face etched with both hope and dread. Though she had visited Buddy several times over the years, bringing him treats and sharing stories about the brother he still waited for, this visit had a different weight to it. "They're analyzing the letter," she told Harold as they sat in his office, away from the media circus. "Testing for fingerprints, DNA, all of it." Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the cup of tea Martha offered her. "After all this time, to think that James might have left a message. Has Detective Rivera told you anything about what the letter contains?" Harold asked gently. Elizabeth shook her head. "They won't let me see it until they've completed their analysis. But they did confirm it's James's handwriting." The station fell unusually quiet that evening after the media departed and the last commuter train pulled away. Buddy, exhausted from the day's excitement, slept soundly in his bed for the first time in years, without his characteristic alertness. "He knows something's changed," Thomas observed as the three friends shared a late dinner in Harold's office. "Like his watch is finally over." Martha nodded, glancing at the photographs and notes pinned to Harold's investigation board. "But what happens to him now? If they solve James's case, he has no reason to keep waiting." "Elizabeth wants to take him," Harold said. "She says it's what James would have wanted." Their contemplative moment was interrupted by a sharp knock. Detective Rivera stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We've completed our preliminary examination of the letter," he announced without preamble. "Given your involvement in keeping this case alive, I thought you should know what we found." He hesitated, then added, "Elizabeth Carter has authorized me to share this information with you." The detective placed a photocopy of the letter on Harold's desk. The three gathered around, reading James Carter's last known words with bated breath. "Lizzie. Asterisk if you're reading this, something has gone very wrong. The evidence on the flash drive is too dangerous. Westlake is laundering money for people who wouldn't hesitate to finish to protect their operations. I tried to do the right thing, but I think they're onto me. Asterisk. I'm leaving this at the station as a backup. If I don't make it to Millbrook, look in the train station maintenance tunnels. I overheard two men talking about taking care of the problem. There. Asterisk. I had to leave Buddy behind when boarding the train. Please find him. He's all I have left after Sarah. Asterisk. If anything happens to me, the drive is with Buddy. Check his collar. I hid it there when I realized I was being followed. Asterisk. Love you always. James. P.S. Trust no one connected to Westlake. Especially not Malone. Asterisk. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The flash drive, it's been with Buddy all along? Detective Rivera nodded grimly. We checked his collar immediately after finding the letter. There was a hidden compartment sewn into the lining, but it was empty. Empty? Harold echoed, stunned. But that means someone else found it first. The detective confirmed. The question is, when? And who? Harold's mind raced back to that first night, when Martha had taken Buddy home to protect him from the mysterious man watching him. Had someone tampered with the collar during the years since? Or had James's pursuers discovered the hiding place immediately? I need to check the security footage archives, Harold said suddenly. Every instance of someone approaching Buddy over the last 5 years. That would be thousands of hours of video. Thomas protested. Then we'll need help, Harold replied, reaching for his phone to call Alyssa Chen. The investigation took on new urgency. The letter provided concrete evidence that James Carter had been targeted because of information he'd discovered about Westlake Industries' illegal activities. Elizabeth formally requested that the police reopen her brother's case as a potential homicide. Meanwhile, Buddy's story spread worldwide. News outlets from as far away as Japan and Australia ran features about the loyal dog who had potentially helped solve a 5-year-old mystery. Donations poured in for Buddy's care, and a prominent pet food company offered to sponsor him for life. Through it all, the aging retriever maintained his routine, though with a subtle difference. His watchful gaze now carried a hint of expectation rather than endless patience. It was as if he sensed the approaching resolution to his long vigil. 2 weeks after the letter's discovery, Harold received a call from Detective Rivera. We've got something, the detective said, his voice tight with excitement. Security footage from 3 years ago shows someone tampering with Buddy's collar while pretending to pet him. We've identified him as Anton Kovac, head of security for Westlake Industries. So they got the flash drive, Harold said, a mixture of disappointment and vindication washing over him. Yes, but here's where it gets interesting, Rivera continued. Kovac died in a single-car accident 2 days after that footage was taken. And the investigation into Westlake that stalled for years suddenly has new life. The FBI has become involved. Harold relayed this information to Martha and Thomas, and later to Elizabeth when she came to visit Buddy. The implications were clear. Whatever James had discovered was significant enough that people had died to protect it, and possibly died because of it. James always did the right thing, Elizabeth said softly, stroking Buddy's graying head as they sat together on platform 3. Even when it cost him everything. Not everything, Harold corrected gently. He left behind a witness who never gave up. That evening, as Harold was preparing to leave, he found an envelope on his desk that hadn't been there earlier. Inside was a USB drive and a note in unfamiliar handwriting. Asterisk, the original was destroyed, but James sent me a backup before he disappeared. I've been too afraid to use it until now. Buddy's story gave me courage. Make it count. Asterisk. J.R. Janet Reeves, Harold realized. The woman who had warned James that day. With trembling hands, Harold powered up his computer and inserted the drive. As files filled the screen, account numbers, transaction records, names of shell companies and their true owners, he understood at last why James Carter had never returned for his loyal companion, and why Buddy's unwavering vigil would soon shake the foundations of power in ways none of them could have anticipated. The evidence from Janet Reeves's flash drive proved devastating. Within weeks of Harold turning it over to federal authorities, Westlake Industries' stock plummeted as news of the investigation leaked. FBI agents raided corporate headquarters, seizing computers and documents. Malcolm Malone, the CEO, was photographed being escorted from his mansion in handcuffs, a stunning fall for one of the country's most respected executives. For Buddy, now in his 10th year of waiting at Grandview Station, these developments meant little. His world remained focused on Platform 3, where he continued his daily inspections of arriving trains, though with noticeably less energy. Age had caught up with the loyal retriever. His muzzle was completely white, his eyes cloudy with cataracts, and his once fluid movements stiffened by arthritis. "He won't be with us much longer," the veterinarian told Harold during Buddy's monthly checkup. "His heart is wearing out, just like the rest of him. But he's not in pain yet, and his quality of life is still good, especially for a dog his age." The news hit Harold harder than expected. Over the years, Buddy had become more than just a station mascot. He was family to everyone who worked at Grandview. The thought of Platform 3 without its faithful sentinel seemed unimaginable. Elizabeth visited more frequently now, often sitting quietly beside Buddy for hours, showing him old photographs of James and telling him stories about their childhood. She had offered many times to take him home with her, but Buddy steadfastly refused to leave the station for more than brief walks. "He's still waiting," Elizabeth told Harold, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Even after all this time, he believes James is coming back. Or maybe he's waiting for something else," Harold suggested gently. "Some final piece of the puzzle." That piece arrived on a crisp October morning, exactly 10 years after James Carter had boarded his final train. Michael Donovan, the investigative journalist whose articles had helped expose Westlake's criminal activities, stepped off the 9:15 from Millbrook and froze at the sight of Buddy dozing in his bed. "My God!" he whispered, approaching slowly. "After all this time." The retriever, sensing a newcomer, lifted his head with effort. Something in Donovan's scent or bearing caught his attention. Buddy struggled to his feet, his tail offering a tentative wag. Harold, who had been watching from nearby, approached cautiously. "You're Michael Donovan," he said. "The reporter?" Donovan nodded, unable to take his eyes off Buddy. "I was James Carter's roommate in college. His best friend." His voice caught. "I've been following his case for years, but I was overseas when you found his letter. I came as soon as I could." From his pocket, Donovan withdrew a worn photograph, a much younger James Carter with his arm around a vibrant golden retriever puppy. "This was Buddy's first day home," Donovan explained. "James sent me this picture, so proud of his new companion. Said Sarah had finally convinced him they needed a dog in their lives." He knelt before Buddy, allowing the elderly dog to sniff his hand. "I never thought I'd actually meet him." To everyone's surprise, Buddy shuffled forward and pressed his muzzle against Donovan's palm, the same gesture of trust he had once shared with James. The journalist's composure broke, tears streaming freely down his face as he gently stroked the dog's head. "You knew, didn't you?" Donovan whispered to Buddy. "All these years you knew." That afternoon, in Harold's office, Donovan revealed the final pieces of James Carter's story, details that even the federal investigation hadn't uncovered. "James contacted me 3 days before he disappeared," Donovan explained, clutching a cup of coffee. "He was terrified, said he'd discovered something that could get him finished. He asked me to be ready to receive a package, evidence that needed to be published if anything happened to him." "The flash drive?" Martha asked. Donovan shook his head. "No, something else. Photographs he'd taken of a meeting between Malone and representatives of a terrorist organization. James had security clearance for the company's server room for his IE work. He accidentally accessed the wrong surveillance feed and saw something he shouldn't have." "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Thomas asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. "Because the package never arrived," Donovan replied. "And 2 days after James disappeared, my apartment was broken into. Nothing was taken, but everything was searched. I received a phone call that night. No words, just the sound of a gun being cocked. He swallowed hard. I was a coward. I convinced myself there was nothing I could do without evidence. Until now, Harold said. Donovan nodded. The federal investigation changed everything. With Malone arrested and his network exposed, I finally felt safe enough to come forward with what I knew. He leaned forward. But there's more. In his last call, James mentioned hiding something at the station, not just a letter, but something else. Something he called the insurance policy. Did he say what or where? Harold asked, suddenly alert. Only that it was where no one would think to look, but everyone would see. Donovan spread his hands helplessly. I've been trying to decipher that for a decade. The group fell silent, contemplating this new puzzle. It was Martha who finally made the connection. Buddy's doghouse, she said abruptly. It's been in plain sight for years, but no one would think to examine it carefully. Within minutes, they were gathered around Buddy's custom-built shelter on Platform 3. The elderly dog watched with unusual alertness as Harold carefully examined the structure. The baseboards seem thicker than they need to be, Harold observed, running his fingers along the bottom edge. And this panel feels different from the others. With gentle pressure, the wood slid aside, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside was a waterproof pouch containing a memory card and a handwritten note dated the day before James's disappearance. To whoever finds this. Asterisk, if you're reading this, I likely didn't survive. The attached contains video evidence of Malcolm Malone meeting with known terrorists on September 30th, 2015. I've encrypted it with a key only my sister Elizabeth would know, Sarah's birthday plus Buddy's adoption date. Asterisk. Asterisk, I don't know who I can trust anymore, so I'm leaving this where only Buddy would lead someone to look. He's the most loyal soul I've ever known. Asterisk. Asterisk, if you're kind enough to find this, please keep him safe. And make sure the truth comes out. Asterisk. James Carter. Harold looked up at Buddy, who had settled back in his bed, watching them with quiet dignity. He didn't just hide evidence, Harold realized. He left Buddy as the key to finding it. That's why he's been so fixated on this exact spot all these years. Donovan knelt beside the aging retriever, gently stroking his head. You weren't just waiting, he whispered. You were guarding. Standing watch over the truth until someone worthy came along. Buddy sighed deeply, leaning into the journalist's touch. For the first time in 10 years, the tension seemed to leave his body completely, as if a long-held burden had finally been lifted. That evening, after federal agents had carefully documented and collected James's final evidence, Elizabeth sat with Buddy on Platform 3, the retriever's head resting in her lap. Donovan joined them, sharing stories of the James they had both loved. As the last train of the day pulled away, Buddy lifted his head suddenly, his cloudy eyes fixed on something only he could see. His tail thumped weakly against the platform, once, twice, before he settled back against Elizabeth with a contented sigh that seemed to carry a decade of patient waiting. He knows, Elizabeth whispered, tears streaming down her face. Somehow, he knows it's finally over. What none of them realized was that Buddy's extraordinary vigil was indeed approaching its end, not with sadness, but with a final, heart-melting revelation that would transform their understanding of loyalty forever. The trial of Malcolm Malone and 6 other Westlake executives dominated headlines for months. Michael Donovan's articles, featuring the evidence James Carter had hidden and Buddy had guarded, exposed a network of corruption that stretched across continents. The loyal dog who had waited 10 years for justice became a symbol of unwavering dedication, his story touching millions around the world. Through it all, Buddy remained at Grandview Station, though his daily routine had subtly changed. He no longer inspected every arriving train with the same desperate hope. Instead, he rested contentedly in his bed, accepting affection from visitors and watching the comings and goings with serene detachment. It was as if, having fulfilled his purpose, he could finally allow himself to rest. Elizabeth divided her time between testimony at Malone's trial and visits to Buddy. She had renovated her home in Millbrook to accommodate an elderly dog, hoping that once the trial concluded, Buddy might finally agree to leave the station with her. The prosecution rests tomorrow, she told Harold one crisp November afternoon as they watched Buddy dozing in a patch of sunlight on Platform 3. After that, I can focus on giving him the retirement he deserves. Harold nodded, though something in his expression suggested doubt. 10 years is a long time to be in one place, he said carefully. I wonder if... He trailed off as Buddy suddenly raised his head, ears perked forward with an alertness they hadn't seen in months. The 3:50 train from Hillsdale was approaching, not a train from Millbrook, not one Buddy had ever shown particular interest in before. What is it, boy? Elizabeth asked, noticing the change in his demeanor. With effort, Buddy rose to his feet, his cloudy eyes fixed on the approaching train. His tail began to wag, not the polite acknowledgement he offered visitors, but the vigorous, whole-body enthusiasm they had glimpsed only in decade-old security footage of his younger days with James. Something's different, Martha whispered, having joined them during her break. I've never seen him react like this. The train glided to a stop, doors hissing open. Buddy took a tentative step forward, then another, his nose working frantically as he processed the sense of disembarking passengers. Then, astonishingly, he began to bark, sharp, joyful sounds that none of them had heard from him in years. From the center car emerged a thin man with a pronounced limp, leaning heavily on a cane. His face was gaunt, deeply lined, and his dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples. He wore simple clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, a worn jacket, and carried nothing but a small backpack. Buddy's barking reached a crescendo. Breaking free from his arthritic caution, the old dog lurched forward with surprising speed, covering the distance to the stranger in an awkward, desperate run. The man stopped, staring in disbelief at the approaching retriever. His cane clattered to the platform as he dropped to his knees, arms outstretched. Buddy? The name emerged as a hoarse whisper. My God! Buddy? The reunion that followed left not a dry eye on Platform 3. Buddy reached the kneeling man and nearly bowled him over, whimpering and crying, licking his face, pressing against him with such force that both nearly toppled onto the platform. The man buried his face in Buddy's white-muzzled neck, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Elizabeth stood frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. James? She finally managed, her voice barely audible. James? The gaunt man looked up, tears streaming down his weathered face. Lizzie, he said simply. I found my way back. The explanation came later, in Harold's office, where James Carter, impossibly, miraculously alive, sat with Buddy pressed against his leg, the dog refusing to be separated from his master by even inches. They caught me at Riverside Junction, James explained, his voice rough from years of disuse. Malone's men. They were going to finish me, but realized I might have hidden copies of the evidence. His hand trembled as he stroked Buddy's head. They wanted to know where, how many, who else knew. For 10 years? Harold asked, still struggling to process the impossible return. James nodded grimly. Not in America. They smuggled me to a black site overseas. No name, no rights, no contact. Just endless questions and... He swallowed hard. Persuasion techniques. But how did you escape? Thomas asked, his voice hushed with awe. I didn't, James replied. When the FBI raid started, things got chaotic. My guards disappeared one night. I think they were cutting ties, eliminating liabilities. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. They thought I was too broken to be a threat anymore. Too broken to find my way back. But you did, Martha said softly. James's eyes turned to Buddy, his expression softening with a love that transcended the decade of separation. I had something to come back for, he said simply. Someone waiting. How did you know? Elizabeth asked, wiping tears from her cheeks. How could you possibly know he would still be here? James was quiet for a moment, his fingers gently tracing the contours of Buddy's graying face. Because I knew him, he finally said. Because the night before I left, that last night, I told him to wait for me if we got separated. To stay where he could see the trains. His voice broke. I told him I'd come back for him, no matter how long it took. The room fell silent as the weight of this revelation settled over them. Buddy hadn't just been waiting out of instinct or habit. He had been following his master's final command, maintaining his vigil with absolute faith that James would keep his promise. 10 years, Harold murmured. 10 years of perfect trust. When I finally made it back to the States, James continued, I saw a newspaper with his story. The Waiting Dog of Grandview. I couldn't believe it. After all this time. He buried his face in Buddy's fur again, overcome with emotion. Elizabeth moved to embrace her brother, completing the circle of reunion. You're really here, she whispered. You're really alive. The news of James Carter's miraculous return spread quickly. Reporters clamored for interviews, federal agents arrived to take statements, and crowds gathered outside the station hoping to glimpse the man and dog whose bond had defied time, distance, and seemingly death itself. Through it all, Buddy remained glued to James's side, his eyes rarely leaving his master's face, as if afraid James might disappear again if he looked away. What happens now? Martha asked as the initial chaos began to subside. James looked down at Buddy, then at his sister, then around at the station that had been the center of so much loyalty and hope. Now we go home, he said simply. All of us. Together. 3 days later, as a gentle snow began to fall, James and Elizabeth prepared to take Buddy home to Millbrook. The station staff had organized a small ceremony, unveiling a permanent plaque on Platform 3. Asterisk for 10 years, Buddy waited here, keeping faith when others would have given up hope. His loyalty protected truth, preserved justice, and ultimately reunited him with the master who never stopped fighting to return to him. May all who pass through Grandview Station be inspired by his unwavering devotion. Asterisk. As the small group of friends who had watched over Buddy gathered to say goodbye, Harold bent down to the retriever one last time. You knew all along, didn't you? He said softly. Somehow you knew he was still out there. Buddy looked up at Harold, then at James, his eyes bright with a wisdom beyond human understanding. In that gaze was the answer to the mystery that had captivated millions. His weight had never been about blind hope or inability to move on. It had been about absolute faith, the certainty that promises made would be promises kept, no matter how impossible the odds. James helped Buddy into the back seat of Elizabeth's car, settling beside him for the journey to their new home. As they pulled away from Grandview Station, the elderly dog rested his head contentedly on his master's lap, his decade-long mission finally complete. In a world where loyalty often seemed fleeting and promises easily broken, Buddy had demonstrated a devotion so pure and unshakable that it had not only survived a decade of waiting, it had helped bring a man back from the dead, exposed powerful criminals, and reminded everyone who heard his story of what it truly meant to love without reservation or limit. That was the heart-melting revelation behind the Waiting Dog of Grandview Station. Not that he had waited for 10 years, but that he had never, for a single moment, doubted that his wait would end exactly as it did, with the return of the master who had promised to come back for him, no matter how long it took.